so going there with you.
All right, welcome back to another week of Into the Promised Land. Last week we saw God deliver the Israelites from their bondage in Egypt. This happened through the 10th plague that God brought on the Egyptians, where it brought about the death of all of the firstborn males. And we saw that God also brought the Israelites, He saved them from this death through the blood of the Passover lamb, which we learned about last week was an illustration of Jesus coming as the Messiah. And from this, the Israelites start their journey into the Promised Land. And, hang on. Sorry, I just started the timer on my phone, which is going to go off. All right. So they're starting the journey into the Promised Land, and God has brought them out of Egypt. So I guess, because they're following God's plan, that everything is going to be easy, right? Everything's going to be fine from here on out. But you should know from living life that that's not always the case, right? James 1 explains this truth like this. It says in James 1, verse 2, "Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Right? And God has many lessons for the Israelites to learn on this journey, just like He has for you and me. And James says to us that the best way to learn and grow in our relationship with God and in our faith in Him is to experience some trials and some hardships. And for the Israelites, the first trial that they're going to face is with Pharaoh. And you might be like, I thought we left that guy behind in Egypt, right? We just got out of there. Yeah, we did, right? He and all the Egyptians are in shock from losing their firstborn sons, and that's why they let the Israelites go. But that shock wears off, and now all they're left with is anger. And so Pharaoh gathers his entire army, which we are told includes hundreds of chariots, which at this time, chariot is the biggest technological advancement in war. And so one of the largest and most technologically advanced armies in the world is coming after the defenseless Israelites. And to make things worse, the Israelites are backed into a corner. See, they'd made it to this location on the map here. So here we are at the Red Sea. The Red Sea was in front of the Israelites, and it was way too big for them to cross. And behind them was the giant Egyptian army. And so it looks like there's no way out. So let's see what the people's reaction to this first trial is. So in Exodus 14, let's read what happens. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. And they were terrified, and they cried out to the Lord. But they said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us out here into the desert to die? What have you done bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we just say to you in Egypt, 'Leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians'? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die out here in the desert." So, not a very good reaction, right? You might think that they would remember how God had just miraculously brought them out of their slavery, right? When they had no way that they can help themselves. But unfortunately, like we often do as well, they seem to have very quickly forgotten what God had done in their past to help them. And they even go so far as to wish that God had just left them alone, saying they'd rather be back in slavery than out on this journey with God. But thankfully, God and Moses here don't listen to the people. And look at what Moses says, back to verse 13. So Moses answered the people and he said, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm and you will see the deliverance of the Lord." Remember, that's Yahweh from last time. "The Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today, you will never see again. The Lord, Yahweh, will fight for you. You need only to be still." Because you see, what looked like a terrible situation from the Israelites' perspective was actually all part of God's plan. If we actually look back a few verses, we can see who is actually behind the Egyptians being out there in the first place. Because God had already told Moses that this was going to happen. And look at what he told Moses back in verse 4 of this chapter. God says this, "And I," this is God speaking, "will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his army. And the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord, Yahweh." So you see, this was God's plan, right? He had orchestrated what looks to the Israelites like a terrible event, right? But not because he was a bad God, like they were saying, right? No, because God's plans are always about his glory and our good. God's plans are always about his glory and our good. But it may just be hard for us to understand this while we're in the middle of the trial, just like the Israelites. All right, well, let's see what happened then. Let's see what happens next. So back to 14, verse 21. "So Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove back the sea," this is the Red Sea, "with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry land with a wall of water on their right and on their left." So this here is the famous parting of the Red Sea that you may have heard about before or seen depicted. At God's command, the water was separated into two walls of water, opening up a pathway which allowed the whole allowed the whole nation of Israel to escape through. But you see, escape wasn't all that God was up to. Because the Egyptians see what's happening, and the whole army goes in after him, right? So watch what God does here. Verse 24. "So during the last watch of the night, the Lord looked down from the pillar of fire and cloud at the Egyptian army, and he threw it into confusion. He jams the wheels of their chariots so that they had difficulty driving. And the Egyptians say, 'Let's get away from the Israelites because the Lord, Yahweh, is fighting for them against Egypt.' So God uses their technological advancements, their chariots, to actually slow them down. And then he springs the trap. He brings those walls of water of the Red Sea back down directly on top of the entire army. And Exodus 14 tells us that not one person of this entire army survived. So God saves the Israelites here, but it's even more than that, right? Because God has a bigger plan. 40 years later, when they finally made it to the promised land, we'll get there eventually, we'll see that God's plan that started here is still at work. When Joshua is spying out the land, Rahab tells the spies that the whole land of Canaan is actually terrified because they had heard of what God had done to the Egyptian army here at the crossing of the Red Sea. But it's even more than that. Fast forward 500 years later, and we're told that the Philistines, who were enemies of Israel that were living in the promised land at the time, The Philistines are terrified of the God of Israel because of all that he had done to Pharaoh right here that we just read about. Right? So not only are God's plans always about his glory and our good, but we see here too, they're often much, much bigger and more long-lasting than just our little part of it. They can be on a much larger scale than we could ever imagine. Now, for the Israelites here, they're still learning how to trust in God in these hardships. And unfortunately, this isn't going to be the last of their hardships, right? On this journey to the promised land, they're actually going to experience lots of hardships. So just real briefly, a couple of them. In Exodus 15, they're out in the desert and they don't have water to drink. And they think they're going to die of thirst. In Exodus 17, as they're in the desert, they think they're going to starve because they don't have enough food. But instead of remembering these other times that God had come through when they'd faced these trials, each time they actually complain and blame God and wish they were back in Egypt again. Yet every single time, God miraculously provides. We see in Exodus 15, he makes the water sweet. And then 2 other times, he brings water straight out of a rock in Exodus 17 and Numbers 20. And he provides food, making bread called manna literally fall out of the sky. And he provides quail for meat. And this starts in Exodus 16. And every single day for the next 40 years, God brings this food to them miraculously. Okay, so as God is daily providing for the Israelites' physical needs, for the next 3 months then, he leads them through the desert down to a mountain near the tip of the Sinai Peninsula that you can see right here. So we made it from the Red Sea down to the Sinai Peninsula to a mountain there that we call Mount Sinai. And here, God will initiate a covenant with Israel. And you might be like, what is a covenant, right? I'm glad you asked, right? At this time period, a covenant is extremely important. It was a solemn promise that was often made between a king and his subjects, where both would promise something. The king would promise protection, while the subjects would promise loyalty to the king. And this covenant that God makes here is extremely, extremely important in the Old Testament. And it's what we currently refer to as the Old Covenant, right? In contrast to the New Covenant, which Jesus brings us into in the New Testament. And the Old Covenant here was centered around the Israelites promising to follow the law, which we'll talk about in a second, while God promises to protect and make them prosper while they're in the Promised Land. So as part of the Old Covenant here, God gives his divine law to the Israelites right here at Mount Sinai. All right, so let's talk about the law. Let's talk about what that is. The law has 3 main parts, 3 basic parts. There's the 10 Commandments, which you may have thought was the entire law. That's just 1/3 of it. This is the basics of the law. It's the gist of the law. Then there's also what I'm calling the laws for living. And what basically these did, what they applied the basics of the 10 Commandments to daily life. And they include various laws, even about food, clothing, and farming practices. And then there's what I'm calling the laws for worship. Now, these laws set up the priesthood and gave instructions on the building of the tabernacle where God's glory would dwell as he lived among the people. And it gave regulations for the offerings and the sacrifices, and instructions regarding all of the religious festivals. So, while the law is quite extensive and covers multiple books and chapters in the Bible, the entire law can be summed up into 2 primary commandments. And actually, Jesus himself does this for us. So let's look at that. In Matthew 22, Jesus says this about the law. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And he says, all the law and the prophets, that's the entire Old Testament, all the law hang on these two commandments. And so the 10 commandments then basically can be divided neatly into these two laws that Jesus was talking about. The ones on the left are about loving the Lord. And the ones on the right are about loving people. Go to that next slide. There it is. There it is. That's the entire law. Okay, so that's what the law is, and there's a lot more, and we don't have time to go into it, right? But what is the purpose of the law? Why did he give this to the Israelites? Why was this a part of the covenant? What was God doing here? Well, a major purpose of the law was to define for us and for the Israelites what sin is. See, because through the law, there's no question how God views things like theft, adultery, murder. And the penalties recorded in the laws for living underscore just how serious God takes sin. And the Apostle Paul, writing years later, who knew more about the law probably than any other writer in the New Testament because he had studied for 10 years as a Pharisee, he writes to the Christians in Rome about the purpose of the law. So let's look at that in Romans 3. Paul says this, therefore, no one will be declared righteous in God's sight by the works of the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of our sin. And then again, in chapter 7, he says this, I would not have known what sin was had it not been for the law. For I wouldn't known what it was to covet. For I would have not known what coveting really was it the law had not said you shall not covet. So a major purpose of the law was to show us what sin is and what God thinks about it. By showing what sin was, the law does something else though. The law also showed us by extension then that we are all sinful. Because no one could possibly keep the law perfectly. That's why the laws for worship actually contained instructions on how to provide temporary forgiveness if someone breaks the law. Part of the law was saying, here's what to do when someone breaks the law. In Leviticus 1 through chapter 7, God sets up a series of animal sacrifices which would roll back the sins of the people. So through the law, God actually teaches his people that there are consequences for sin. Consequences that ultimately will require death. And like the Passover lamb in Egypt, the Israelites would see these innocent animals dying in their place over and over again to roll back their own sin. But these sacrifices in the system were always meant to be temporary, right? The Israelites had to be continually offering sacrifices again and again and again to atone for their sin. That is until Jesus the Messiah, who we talked about last week, was the perfect lamb. He comes himself as the ultimate sacrifice to fulfill the law. This is talked about in Matthew 5. So 1,300 years here before the coming of Christ, the law was about pointing us towards our need for a Savior. Okay, so after spending about a year here at Mount Sinai, receiving the law of the Old Covenant, the Israelites now set out again on their journey heading for the Promised Land. And they arrive here on our map at a place called Kadesh Barnea. And Kadesh Barnea borders the promised land. Guys, we've made it. The promised land of Canaan is right there. And God tells Moses, send a leader from each of the 12 tribes into Canaan so that they can spy out the fortifications of the towns and report back then on what the land is like and what the people are like and what the produce is like. So for 40 days, they explore the promised land. And when these 12 spies come back, they've got quite a bit to say. So let's see what they say. In Numbers 13, this is what they say. They gave Moses this account. We went into the land to which you sent us, and it does flow with milk and honey. We talked about that last week. And here's the fruit, right? And the Bible describes here this crazy fruitfulness of the land because they brought back a cluster of grapes that was so large it had to be carried on a pole between two of the people. So it really was super fruitful, flowing with milk and honey like God had said. They're like, yeah, this place is a paradise, just like God said, but then they have something else. Look at verse 32. And they spread among the Israelites a bad report about the land that they had explored. They said, the land we explored devours those living in it. All the people we saw there are of great size. We saw the Nephilim there. I'll talk about what that is. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. So they tell people, yeah, the land is great, but if we go in there, we're going to be devoured. Right? That's what it means by the land devours those. Because the people are huge. We were like insects compared to them. And they mention here the Nephilim. The Nephilim are referred to by several different names in the Bible because different local people call them different things. Sometimes they're called the Nephilim. Sometimes they're called the Anakites. Sometimes they're called the Rephaim. Who are they? Well, the word Rephaim, which they're referred to a lot, literally means fearsome ones, right? They're described here and in other places of the Bible as giants, what would seem like giants. They were a race of very large people, perhaps as tall as 7 to 9 feet. So in the presence of these fearsome ones in the land, it makes the spies so afraid that they're going to question God. And they don't think that he can do what he had promised to do in the covenant with them. Now, thankfully, not all of the spies felt like this. Of the 12 spies, only 2 of them, Joshua and Caleb, who are going to be very important later, they tried to bring a good report based in faith in God rather than fear of what their eyes had seen. So let's look at what they say in Numbers 14, verse 8. It says, if the Lord is pleased with us, he will lead us into that land, a land flowing with milk and honey, and will give it to us. But only don't rebel against the Lord, and do not be afraid of the people in the land, because we will devour them, right? They won't devour us. We will devour them, because their protection is gone, because the Lord is with us. So don't be afraid of them. But unfortunately, the people choose to listen to the 10 spies rather than the 2 that brought the good report. And just like we had seen them done in the past, when Pharaoh's army came up, instead of trusting in God based on what he had done for them all these times in the past, look at what they do. In Numbers 14, verse 2, it says this, all the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, if only we had died in Egypt. They're saying the same thing again. Or in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land only to let us fall by the sword? Our wives and our children are going to be taken as plunder. Wouldn't it be better for us just to go back to Egypt? See, they had watched God miraculously bring them out of slavery. And they had watched him defeat the strongest army in the world at the time. They had watched him feed them miraculously with bread and meat and water in the desert. And they had entered into this covenant with Yahweh himself, where he promises his protection. They were right on the edge of the promised land. It was right there. But still, they refused to put their faith in God. And because of this lack in faith, God decides to punish the entire nation of Israel. So look at this in verse 30. God says, "Not one of you will enter the land I swore with uplifted hand to make your home, except for Caleb and Joshua. As for your children that you said would be taken as plunder, I'll bring them in to enjoy the land that you rejected. But as for you, your bodies will fall in the wilderness." So God tells Moses that every adult, everyone who should have known better, not a single one of them will ever get to set foot into this promised land that they had just seen, other than Caleb and Joshua, who were the only two that believed in him. So as I wrap this up, Tillman, you can go ahead and come up. We see this is where our journey into the promised land stalls, right? We made it here. We made it to the promised land, but we don't go in. And for the next 40 years, a year for every day that they had explored the land, God leads the Israelites around the desert, moving from place to place, while the entire generation of Israelites who refuse to believe God and go in, why they die out. Because God had promised them victory. As Caleb and Joshua had said, the land, he had commanded them to go in and take it. It was already theirs. They simply had to put their trust in God and watch what he would do, just like they had to do at the Red Sea. But they decided to put their trust into what they could see with their eyes and what they could understand with their minds rather than what God had said. And I think, how often do we live our lives like this as well? When we come up against trials or hard times, do we act just like the Israelites here? Do we forget what God has done in our past? And do we only focus on just how bad the situation looks from our perspective? Because when you see, when we do that, we're putting God into a box. We're like, yeah, God, you may have done some stuff for me in the past, and maybe all that was good, but, this right here is too hard. Because he can't help me through my mom's death. He can't help me through my parents' divorce. He can't help me find true and lasting friendships. He can't keep me from looking at pornography. I can't see how this can work out, right? I can't see how this will happen. So because I can't understand it, God must not be able to do it then. And we think like this all the time, but this mentality isn't faith in God at all. That's only faith in our human understanding. And y'all, if that's the God that you're believing in, one that you have to be able to understand, then this isn't God at all. Remember, God said he is Yahweh, the great I am, who exists before, now, and forever. When you can't imagine how you can get through a situation, turn and put your faith in him. Turn and put your faith in Yahweh. Hear him tell you, like he told Moses, you are not capable of doing this, but I am Yahweh. So if you're here tonight, what is your lack of faith keeping you from? Have you forgotten about all the times in your past where he has come through for you, just like the Israelites had? What promises are you missing out on because you're trusting in your own understanding instead of trusting in God? So let's pray. Dear God, I'm sorry. God, I'm sorry for all the times that I have done this exact same thing as the Israelites, where I've looked at what's going on in my life and said, I can't figure a way out of this, so there must be no way out of this. God, I'm sorry for not remembering the things that you've done in my past. And God, help these students to learn from the mistakes that we read about here of the Israelites. God, help them not to have to go through life only having faith in things that they can see. God, thank you for your patience with us. Thank you for your patience with the Israelites who day after day would complain to you, but you still were providing for us. God, help these students tonight to gain that understanding. If they walk out of here with nothing else, to know that when they can't find a way through the pain and the hurt of this world, that they'll remember what you did here with these Israelites. And they'll put their faith in you even when they can't see how it's going to turn out. And God, we praise you for all that you are going to do and continue to do.